So what I want to explain today is that transmedia stories, for a lot of the reasons that I started to talk about earlier, can be even more powerful for brands than regular stories can be. So I wanted to talk about a case study, and actually it's not a very new case study. By hand, is anyone here familiar with BMW Films? It was a project that came out in 2001, 2002. Seeing a bunch of nodding. I talk about this a lot lately, and people always think that's strange because transmedia advertising and transmedia storytelling is this new phrase, and people always think that the examples are going to be really new things that they haven't heard of yet. And so when I talk about something that's already 8, 9 years old, people wonder, well, if transmedia storytelling was happening back then why are you wasting our time with it now? This isn't something that's new. But the interesting thing about BMW Films is that in some ways it's still a better example of what it looks like for a brand to tell a story than almost anything anyone's done since then. So rather than just describing it, I want to talk about what happened with BMW Films and why it worked and what anyone involved with brands should have learned from it about how to interact with the audience. So here's what most people remember about BMW Films. 7 or 8 years ago, BMW paid for and put out a series of short 5-6-minute films on the internet, and they all had BMW cars in them. It was a little bit James Bond-like. There was this smooth, sophisticated action hero who drove the car, and if you took just the chase scene out of every James Bond movie, that was basically what this show was. It was a bunch of chase scenes that had different stories around them and were really fun to watch. So it sort of made sense, because James Bond actually, when he hasn't been driving an Aston Martin, already drives BMWs sometimes. So it begged this question that a lot of people asked when BMW Films came out of why make new stories that are just about BMW cars and not just put more cars in the Bond movies. There are a lot of reasons for that, which I'll come back to later, but what they decided to do so that they weren't just tagging along for the ride with the Bond movies was to invent a new character whose entire job was to be an incredible driver. And in fact, they never gave him a name. His name was just The Driver. And they released 8 short films on the internet over 2 years, and they broke them into 2 seasons. They did 5 at first, and they thought that would be it, and then the response was so amazing that they did 3 more. So a few more details about that. One of the really key things that happened, and why this is such an important project, is because they really focused on quality. Above all, nobody working on this project started out thinking, we're telling a story for a brand. They started out thinking, we need to tell a really good story, and the brand needs to have some kind of place in that. So that was really the only brand requirement. It had to include the car somewhere, but no one had to say BMW, no one had to talk about the car, the camera didn't have to sit on the car and show you how amazing it looked, you didn't have to see all these great features. They just needed the car to be in the story. Then the first 5 films that they did cost $25 million in US to produce, which is, I mean, for an advertisement, that's unbelievable. That's a budget that even movies sometimes don't have. What was really interesting about that is that out of that budget, and this, for anyone who does media buying or planning, this is an amazing statistic, they spent 90% of their money just on making the films. They only spent 10% or saved 10% of their money to do any work to make sure that anybody heard about the films or knew that they existed or pay for them to go anywhere. At the same time, that 10% of the money they used was used to treat these films like they were their own movie. Not to say, hey, we're BMW and we've made these little movies that have BMWs in them, but just like any movie, there's this amazing new story coming out, it stars these amazing actors. No one said anything about BMW except that it was made by BMW Films. There were posters, there were movie trailers in the theaters, and maybe most important in some ways, it featured these movies were made by a lot of really well-known and well-loved directors and actors and celebrities. So we'll come back to that in a minute. I just want to, for anyone who hasn't seen any of them before or who hasn't seen them in about 7 years, I just wanted to show a minute or two of one of them now for reference. There should be sound also. Any sound? It's going to make so much less sense without sound. Yeah, I'm gonna pause that for a second. Is there any way to get sound working? Maybe that meant sound. Nope. Anyone? Tech? So Sao Paulo is really nice. Yeah. Still nothing.
The first thing you notice physically about this lady is her eyes. Bright blue eyes. It's rare to actually see those eyes because they usually go out, but when you do, it's worth it. The next thing you notice is her hands. Strong, powerful, yet feminine hands. But the real heart stopper that this woman has in her galaxy of talents is her voice. Her billion-dollar voice. She's a legend in her lifetime. She's achieved giddy heights few have equaled. She's unrivaled in the world. And she's a complete coward.
Right or not? Son, get over here. Hey, Glenn is right in. Glenn is here to say you are an idiot. You are such a moron. This is not what I pay you for.
Glenn, a manager for 7 years. No backbone on the man.
Not a problem, sweetheart. We will work it out, okay?
But he gets paid enough not to have one.
Coffee. I want a coffee. It better not be cold. I do. I'm so over black. Take the bus.
So that's, for anyone who doesn't know, the woman in that clip was a singer who's very famous in America named Madonna. I don't know if anyone in Brazil has heard of her. So the clip was interesting for a few reasons. Partly because it was just beautiful. It's at the same level of quality as a movie, but also because in those first few minutes, and if you watched all the way through for the other 4 or 5, they never talk about the car. Nobody says anything about it. And one reason that's really important and kind of consistent with why people care about stories is that nobody spends, well, some people spend all of their lives talking about cars and about brands, but very few people. Most people care about cars for where it fits into their life or what they do with it or what kind of lifestyle it gives them. And that's the only role that BMW played in these movies. It was about what they made possible and what kind of lifestyle they went with, but not about them at all. So coming back to what makes this transmedia, what was interesting about these movies was that they did, over 2 years, 8 films, and each of those films was a different story. It wasn't clear if they took place before each other or after each other or what the relationship was, but each of the stories told you something new about the character, the driver, and added new details to the whole. What was also really interesting about it, especially for anyone who works in an ad agency, maybe you'll know how unusual this is. When they started writing the films, even before they started writing the films, they created a government file on the main character that just had records of everything he had ever done wrong and what the government knew about him and what was unknown about his past and what he liked and what he didn't like. And none of those things necessarily ever got mentioned in the movie, but they were this file that they made about him never got shown to the audience. But it was a really kind of key way of making sure that he wasn't just a character who existed to drive a BMW, but an actual character, someone that people would be interested in and care about.